For years, George Harrison was the quiet Beatle, the spiritual one, the junior partner in the most famous songwriting duo in history. He was often treated like an afterthought, his own genius rationed out, only allowed to shine when it didn't throw shade on the two guys out front. He'd been talked down to, his songs had been brushed aside, and his creative voice was consistently muffled. But in January 1969, during a miserable recording session, one man pushed him too far. It wasn't a big screaming match that did it. It was a quiet, dismissive comment from Paul McCartney that triggered a walkout fueled by years of resentment. An act that sent George Harrison storming away from the biggest band in the world. This is the story of the long, simmering feud that really broke the Beatles, and how one man's need for control nearly suffocated his oldest friend. The date was January 10, 1969. The place, Twickenham Film Studios, a cold, empty, and deeply unhappy film set where the Beatles were supposed to be getting back to their roots. After a tense lunch break and an argument that's now legendary, George Harrison calmly packed up his guitar. He looked at the guys he'd grown up with and said something like, "I'm leaving the band now. See you around the clubs." That evening, he opened his diary and, in just a few words, recorded the end of an era. Got up, went to Twickenham, rehearsed until lunchtime, left the Beatles, went home. Just like that. But this wasn't a sudden snap. This was the final crack in a bond that had been fracturing for years. So what pushed him to that point? What was the festering wound, as John Lennon later called it, that finally tore open? The answer isn't just one argument. It's a long history of being the third man in a two-man race, and in the uniquely frustrating behavior of his friend, Paul McCartney. To really get the explosion of 1969, you have to rewind. From day one, George held a strange spot in the Beatles' hierarchy. He was the youngest, brought into the band by Paul. And as Paul himself admitted years later, he kind of always talked down to George, unable to shake the image of him as the kid brother he was when they met. That dynamic set in stone pretty early. John and Paul were the leaders, the songwriters. George was the lead guitarist. A crucial role, sure, but a supporting one. In the early days, that was fine. He was a teenager living a life bigger than his wildest dreams. But as the Beatles got more complex, so did George. The first real cracks started showing around 65 and 66. While John and Paul were writing pop masterpieces, George was going through a huge spiritual and musical awakening. His discovery of Indian music, his lessons with Ravi Shankar, it opened up a whole new universe of sound for him. He started writing these deep, questioning, musically complex songs that were nothing like the Lennon-McCartney formula. And that's where the trouble really started. For George, bringing a new song to the band was basically bracing for rejection. The Lennon-McCartney partnership wasn't just creative, it was a commercial beast. Albums only had so much room, and that room was reserved for the two guys in charge. George had to fight for his 1 or 2 songs per album, and he found the whole process humiliating. He'd present his work and get met with a shrug or worse, condescending advice. Paul, especially, seemed to have a massive blind spot for George's talent. Paul saw music in terms of pop hooks and structure. George's more spiritual explorations just didn't fit, and Paul could be pretty dismissive. The 1968 sessions for The White Album became a huge battleground. That album was sprawling and messy, which should have been perfect for George. Instead, it just showed how fractured they were. Ringo even quit for 2 weeks because he felt like such an outsider. George, meanwhile, brought in what would become one of his greatest songs, While My Guitar Gently Weeps. At first, nobody cared. They tried a quiet acoustic version, but it just wasn't clicking. They seemed bored. So, frustrated and feeling totally disrespected, George did something unheard of. He brought an outsider into a Beatles session. He asked his friend, Eric Clapton, to play the guitar solo. The change was immediate. With Clapton in the room, suddenly, everyone was on their best behavior. They were focused, professional, and finally gave the song the energy it deserved. Paul magically came up with a brilliant piano part and a better bass line. The song became the masterpiece we know today, but for George, it was a bitter victory. He had to bring in a celebrity guest just to get his own band to take him seriously. The message was loud and clear. He still wasn't an equal. This feeling of being stifled got even worse in late 1968. He spent time in America, hanging out and playing with Bob Dylan and the band in Woodstock. He saw a totally different way of making music, a relaxed, democratic vibe where musicians actually respected each other's ideas. He came back to England full of songs and confidence, only to be shoved right into Paul McCartney's next big idea: Get Back. On paper, Paul's intentions were good. After the messy White Album, he wanted to get the band back to basics, playing together for a live TV special, but his execution was a disaster. He basically made himself the director of the whole project. He herded them into the freezing, sterile Twickenham film studios in January 1969, a place with zero inspiration. To top it all off, the whole thing was being filmed, capturing every single argument and soul-crushing moment for a documentary. For George, it was a nightmare. He had just tasted artistic freedom, and now he was back in a cage with Paul as the well-meaning but totally insufferable zookeeper. The fuse that had been burning for years was about to hit the dynamite. January 1969. The Beatles were miserable. The Get Back project was supposed to be a fun return to their roots. Instead, it became a televised funeral. The studio at Twickenham was a huge part of the problem. It was a giant, freezing soundstage that felt less like a creative space and more like a lab where they were being watched under a microscope. The atmosphere was just toxic. John Lennon, who usually balanced out Paul's bossiness, was almost completely checked out. He was deep into his heroin addiction and his intense relationship with Yoko Ono, who was always by his side. With John basically gone in all but body, Paul's leadership instincts went into hyperdrive. He became the director, producer, and musical arranger for everything, a role nobody else had voted for. Paul's method was just to grind it out. He had a vision, and he was going to push them until they got there. But to George, it just felt like being lectured. It felt like being managed. It felt like being the kid who wasn't allowed to have a say. Paul would tell him exactly how to play his guitar parts, a massive insult to a musician of George's skill. This all boiled over in one of the most famous arguments in rock history on January 6th, just 4 days before George quit. They were working on Two of Us, and the cameras were rolling. Paul, frustrated, started telling George what to play. His tone is like a tired teacher explaining something simple to a difficult kid. George is just visibly seething. The argument, captured in Peter Jackson's Get Back documentary, is a masterclass in passive aggression. When Paul keeps pushing, George finally snaps back, not with a shout, but with a line dripping with years of resentment. "I'll play whatever you want me to play," he says, his voice completely flat. "Or I won't play at all if you don't want me to play. Whatever it is that will please you, I'll do it." It was never about the guitar riff. It was George saying, "Your control is so total that my creativity doesn't matter. So just tell me what to do, or I'm out." It was a declaration of war disguised as compliance. Paul, seeming to miss the point completely, tries to smooth it over, but the damage was done. He even brought up a time he vetoed one of George's ideas during the recording of Hey Jude, basically proving George's point for him. The days that followed were more of the same. Paul would enthusiastically present songs like Let It Be, while George's own creations, like All Things Must Pass, were met with a collective shrug or the same micromanagement. At one point, while George was trying to get through his song I Me Mine, a deeply personal track about ego, John and Yoko started waltzing around the room, completely ignoring him. It was the ultimate insult. He was being controlled by Paul and ignored by John. He was trapped. Paul thought he was saving the Beatles with discipline. George just wanted the freedom to be himself. The pressure cooker was about to blow. The morning of January 10th, 1969, was just as cold and tense as the rest. The band was grinding through the same songs, and the mood had gone from sour to hostile. The final straw reportedly came during lunch. While it wasn't caught on film, accounts say a nasty argument broke out. George had finally had enough. He was done being lectured, done being ignored, and done being the third wheel. His exit was shockingly quiet. No drama, no big speech. Ringo said they didn't even realize he'd quit until he just didn't come back after lunch. George walked out, told them he was leaving, and drove home. And that very afternoon, he sat down and poured all of his anger and frustration into a new song. The title was a perfect description of how he felt. Wah Wah. In his book, I, Me, Mine, George explained that wah wah was his word for a giant headache. The song wasn't about a guitar pedal. It was about the noise, the pressure, and the negativity from the people around him. As he put it, "You're giving me a bloody headache." The lyrics are a direct shot at the toxic world he'd just escaped. He later confirmed that while he was annoyed with John, the song was mainly a swipe at Paul. A key line reveals everything. I know how sweet life can be if I keep myself free. Freedom. That's what he wanted. Freedom from the fighting. Freedom from the creative handcuffs. And freedom from Paul McCartney's control. Another verse drips with sarcasm. You've made me such a big star, being there at the right time, cheaper than a dime. He's saying the fame was great, but he felt like he was treated as just a cheap, replaceable part of the machine. While Wah Wah was a primal scream, another song from that time, Run of the Mill, was a sadder look at their broken friendships. Lyrics like, Another day for you to realize me, or Send me down again, perfectly capture his feeling of constantly being judged by Lennon and McCartney. Back at Twickenham, the other three Beatles were stunned. The reality finally hit them. In a moment of pure, dark humor, John Lennon immediately suggested they call Eric Clapton to replace George, saying, "He's just as good and not such a headache." It was a cruel joke, but it showed how replaceable he thought George was. Paul, on the other hand, seemed to get it. He knew this could be the end. The day ended with a truly bizarre scene. With George gone, Yoko Ono took his microphone and started shrieking into it, while the remaining Beatles launched into a violent, angry jam session. It was the sound of a band disintegrating in real time. This was the moment the dream was really over. The Beatles had faced problems before, but this was a quiet, firm rejection of the band's entire system. If you're fascinated by the real stories behind the music, make sure you hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell so you don't miss what happens next. For 5 days, the biggest band on the planet didn't exist. Paul, John, and Ringo tried to carry on, but the sessions were pointless. A secret microphone hidden in a flower pot captured them talking about George, admitting they'd let the festering wound of his unhappiness grow for years. It was painfully obvious that without him, the project was dead. They had to get him back. After one failed meeting, all 4 Beatles met for a 5-hour summit at Ringo's house on January 15th. And for the first time ever, George Harrison held all the power. He'd walked away, and they knew they couldn't go on without him. So he laid out his terms. First, Paul's big idea for a live concert was completely off the table. No more arguments about a public show. Second, they were ditching the freezing, miserable Twickenham studios. The sessions would move to their brand new studio in the basement of Apple headquarters, their own turf. The other Beatles had no choice but to agree. It was a massive power shift. The quiet Beatle had given orders to Lennon and McCartney and won. He single-handedly killed Paul's grand vision and forced the band to work on his terms. They reconvened at Apple Studios on January 21st, and the vibe was instantly better. But the real game-changer was George's idea. On January 22nd, he invited his friend, the keyboard genius Billy Preston, to sit in. Just like with Eric Clapton, it was a brilliant move. With a respected guest in the room, everyone was on their best behavior. Paul couldn't be so bossy, and John was more engaged. Preston's joyful playing was the glue that held them together. They salvaged the project, turning it into the film Let It Be with the famous rooftop concert as the climax. That concert was the perfect compromise. A live performance without all the stress, a solution born directly from George's rebellion. But getting George back didn't fix the underlying problems. Paul was still Paul. Years later, George famously said, "Paul is a fine bass player, but he's a bit overpowering at times. I'd join a band with John Lennon any day, but I couldn't join a band with Paul McCartney." Even while recording his masterpiece, Something, George had to tell Paul his bass line was too busy and to simplify it. The fact that he could do that showed his newfound confidence, but the fact that he had to do it showed the conflict was still there. The wound had been stitched up, but it was far from healed. George Harrison's walkout wasn't just a temper tantrum. It was the sound of an artist refusing to be silenced. The fight with Paul McCartney was just the final spark. For years, he'd been stuck as the junior partner, his art taking a back seat to the Lennon-McCartney machine. Paul's need to control everything, made worse by John's indifference, became the focus of all that frustration. Walking out was an act of self-preservation. The peace treaty that brought him back proved the old hierarchy was dead. It allowed them to make one last masterpiece, Abbey Road, but it couldn't fix their broken relationships. The walkout was just a dress rehearsal for the real breakup. In the end, leaving the Beatles was the best thing that ever happened to George Harrison as an artist. The creative dam that had been holding him back for years finally burst. In 1970, he released his triple album, All Things Must Pass, full of songs the Beatles had ignored. It was a massive success, outselling both John and Paul's solo debuts. So while hate is probably too simple a word for a relationship as deep and complicated as his with Paul, there's no doubt that in this period Paul was the source of George's deepest frustration. They would eventually make peace and become close friends again before George passed away, a testament to the brotherly bond that survived it all. But the story of January 1969 is a powerful reminder that creative freedom is always worth fighting for, even if it means walking away from the biggest band in the world.